Part of the reason things have gotten to the point they are now is that for so long, so many people didn't want to have to confront that disconnect between the reality we're told and what reality actually is, what's actually happening. Just because people have been so willing to outsource stuff to the government or the private sector or whatever and not really follow up on it and just assume it's working the way it should, that there are a lot of malfeasance and corruption has been allowed to entrench itself and grow, and that obviously has to be confronted at some point. Will just keep growing until it completely takes over and destroys everything.
We are being lied to by everyone.
We have a corrupt political system.
Government corruption and secrecy are growing in the state of Iowa.
Transparency, vital to our national security. Corruption threatens all of that.
And they're trying to take over. That's the message out from independent writer and investigative journalist Whitney Webb today. Whitney, who has been a long-time critic of the entity she refers to as the Global Public-Private Partnership, which she explains masquerades behind bodies like the World Economic Forum, WEF, is saying today that the situation has reached a critical point. She explains that these bodies have the sole intention of slowly eroding human autonomy until we are completely subject to them, and their weapon of choice is AI and the internet. She believes there might be a chance for correction, but that it's difficult because of how much we have been lied to. She goes on to say that there is no one left to trust, and grappling with the harshness of reality is often difficult because of how different it is from everything we are made to believe. This is why her warning is more important than ever. She pivots from there to discuss even more shocking revelations about FTX and CBDCs. Let's dive in to hear from her.
If you're being lied to consistently about what's really happening and you hear the other side of what's happening and that resonates more with you, ultimately I think that's a positive thing, because if we don't know what's actually going on, we can't fix the problem. And you could argue that a lot of the lies and deception is to keep people from fixing the problem by thinking the problems are all other things. But it is depressing to have to confront that disconnect between what you thought was going on and what's actually going on. But ultimately you have to remember too that the reason so much effort and money is poured into deceiving us, it's because we have the power to change it. And a lot of it just comes down to completely non-violent things people can do, like divesting from certain companies. Specifically lately I've been talking a lot about divesting from big tech as much as possible, just because of where a lot of those big tech billionaires in the national security state they're completely fused with at this point are taking us. A lot of what they are trying to do is entirely predicated on us remaining dependent specifically on their technology, when there's a lot of open source alternatives and other tech companies or developers that could be supported to develop alternative infrastructure. We don't need their tools, and those tools can be made differently. As an example, right? I think part of the reason things have gotten to the point they are now is that for so long, so many people didn't want to have to confront that disconnect between the reality we're told and what reality actually is, what's actually happening. Just because people have been so willing to outsource stuff to the government or the private sector or whatever and not really follow up on it and just assume it's working the way it should, that there are a lot of malfeasance and corruption has been allowed to entrench itself and grow, and that obviously has to be confronted at some point, or it will just keep growing until it completely takes over and destroys everything.
So far, Whitney has clarified that we're currently at a defining point in human history. If we don't step forward now and begin to cut through all the lies, then we'll be crushed under them. Next, she turns her attention to FTX, how it's connected to the Fed, and the plan to create programmable, surveillable money that's essentially a CBDC, but will not be marketed as such. She explains that this currency is currently being subtly pushed in the US, and FTX is related to it. Let's hear it from her.
Basically, Farmington after it was bought by Chalopin and these guys, started to undergo this transition from being this rural community bank, one of the smallest banks in the country, to trying to become part of the Federal Reserve System, changing their name to Moonstone, trying to become the bank of the future, and being involved specifically in the cryptocurrency space, and also in marijuana, illegal marijuana, and just a huge transformation was underway there. Noah Perlman, who I mentioned earlier, was on the board of Moonstone. Also, Chalopin obviously very involved, as was his son Javier Chalopin, who was chief digital officer of Moonstone. Pretty much around the same time, small amount, a couple days difference, I think. Alameda Research poured $11.5 million into this bank, which was at the time twice the whole bank was worth. They swell in like less than a year from 10 million in deposits to like 84 million, and like 74 million of that was just from 4 accounts, and 50 million of that was one account tied to Sam Bankman-Fried that was titled FTX Digital Markets. So you have Sean Jalopine, Deltec, you have SBF and FTX, and Deltec and FTX are obviously connected, and they're basically trying to use this tiny bank for something. And based on what is documentable, there's no way this bank should have been approved by the Fed. It should never have been made part of the Fed system, and the Federal Reserve System refuses to explain still how they approved it and why. And there's also the same sort of like no comment, nothing to see here, even though, yes, local reporter, you bring up good points. They were irrelevant to us at the time or something, from like Washington financial regulators. There was somebody in the Fed system that got this approved when it should not have been approved. Even high people up at the Fed are covering that up. It's essentially what's happening here. FTX collapses and all this scrutiny obviously gets placed on this tiny bank, even from mainstream media and also from congressmen. It was obviously like something was going on there, and it was very obvious to see. And then the Fed has since like issued enforcement actions against Farmington and like forced it to close down. And so it doesn't exist anymore.
In this video, Whitney Webb has provided more insight into how everything we're being told is a lie. In her exposés and other interviews, she has explained that the people in charge understand that US citizens will resist any perceived attacks on their freedom, and as such a traditional central bank digital currency, CBDC, will be dead on arrival. She goes on to explain that these banks also understand that a Federal Reserve CBDC will hamper their abilities to perform fractional reserve banking, and the solution to both problems is allowing each bank to issue their own synthetic CBDCs that will be surveillable and programmable, but still allow them to operate FRB. She reveals that Moonstone and Fluent were one attempt at that before the collapse of FTX disrupted the plans. To cover up their tracks, Moonstone was forced into closing by the Fed, but the question still persists why it was ever approved. Whitney suggests that we were lucky FTX collapsed, and that it has given us insight into the amount of lies we are being told on a daily basis. What do you think about Whitney's terrifying revelations? To see the latest in crypto news, watch this video here.